Joining us now, and we're going to play his ad, is Dan Ward. Dan is running for Congress. He is a Democrat, two Democrats vying for the opportunity to go up against Dave Bratt in November. Dave, the favorite in that race, but has been looked at nationally as one of the districts that might be vulnerable to a Democratic takeover, especially if there's a blue wave, especially because of redistricting and what happened in 2017 and all that good stuff. And so Dan Ward, one of two candidates running for the Democratic nomination for Congress that will be decided in a Democratic primary, with all the other things being decided on June 12th. Before we get to Dan and I tell you a little bit about him, run the audio on Dan's ad.
I'm Dan Ward, and I know having someone on your side can make a big difference. I grew up with 7 brothers and sisters in a cabin with no running water. I worked hard and served my country. Now I'm running for Congress because too many families are scraping just to get by, coming home every day from jobs that don't cover the bills, only to worry about health care they can't afford. Washington doesn't give a damn, but I do. I'm Dan Ward, and I approve this message because these days, we all need someone on our side.
Now, Dan Ward was raised in Central Virginia. He went to Vanderbilt, so he was a Commodore, and he spent 25 years in the Marine Corps flying attack jets in combat missions over Iraq, Bosnia, and Kosovo. That was during the Clinton administration. Colonel Dan Ward later served as a senior military advisor in President Obama's State Department, where he ran cooperative defense programs in Syria and Ukraine before retiring in late 2014. As a civilian, Dan piloted 777s until he became a candidate for Congress. Last year, he advocated for increased aviation safety on behalf of the Airline Pilots Association, ALPA, and Dan lives in a farm in Orange where he raises cattle. Dan, good to have you with us, man.
Hey, good morning, John. How are you doing?
Great. So let's get first.
Before we dive in, enjoy those years with your son, because my 2 kids, they're gone, and those years go by too fast. And wish them happy birthday.
Oh, thanks, Dan. And you're so right. We've got 2 older children, a 28-year-old. My son, first job, my older son, I just saw him, but he's a college professor at the University of Nevada, and that's in Reno. So it's really tough to get out there. And, of course, you know, they've got girlfriends and teaching and jobs, and, you know, it's tough to get them home. And then our daughter is 26. She's in Atlanta. So it's, you know, they get old, they got their own lives, and you talk to them every so often, and that's about the end of it. So I understand exactly what you're saying.
It's depressing, isn't it?
Well, yes. And as the years go by, it even gets tougher. And then you have to go out and see them, right? They don't come back anymore. They just got too much going on in life. So, plus, even at their age, in order to get them home, I got to buy them the tickets. Like, what is up with that? Like, buy your own tickets and come home, right? Probably make more money than I do. What is up with that?
I miss my kids.
I just got to get this out of the way. So when your kids come, if they're out of town and they fly home, do you have to buy them the tickets still?
So one of the fortunate things about being an airline pilot is they get to fly standby.
Oh,
that's fly for free. So
that's right.
Interestingly,
you
my son lives in Scotland, and I can't get him home very much, and it bums me out. My daughter, she's still in college, so she'll be home in about a week. So excited about that.
So Dan, let's get to the Democratic primary. You got a pretty tough opponent that's been running a long time. How do you win the nomination?
Well, you know, John, I've been running this campaign based on just telling it like it is. Very much a straight shooter. I answer people's questions. I answer the questions regardless of who the audience I'm talking to is exactly the same. And I tell you that message is starting to resonate with people because regardless of where people's ideology is, I think we can all agree that we need politicians to be a little more straightforward in their answers and stop taking polls before they answer a question. It's time for, in my mind, it's time for Congress to start doing their job. And that means being a co-equal branch of government. I think Congress has abdicated that responsibility over the years because they're more worried about re-election than they are about doing their job. And so, you know, I look at issues like the authorization of use of military force. You know, that needs to be updated. Congress doesn't want to do it because that's a tough vote. and they're more worried about re-election than they are doing. But that's their job. And so, as somebody, I'm actually still employed by United. So, I've got an amazing job already, and I tell people all the time, listen, I've got a better job than being a congressman anyways. And if you don't like me, vote me out, and I'm okay with that. So that's the approach I'm taking, which is an honest and straightforward approach. And if people like it, they like it. If they don't, that's okay too. So.
Okay, well, look, I think that's the approach you're taking. As far as AOMF is concerned, look, I've been covering this, Dan, for, 8 years. It's maddening that we can't get it done. And everybody says they want to get it done, but then they don't get it done. The president pulled out of the JCPOE, the Iran deal is commonly known. Let's get to policy. Do you think he made the right decision? Why or why not?
So I don't, and this is why. I worked at the State Department at that time. And so we have to put some context in when that deal was signed. The Chinese, the Russians, and the Europeans were not going to continue with the sanctions regime at that time, right? So we were at a point where we're like, well, you better get what you can, because this sanctions is going to come apart, because the rest of the world was tired of it, and we were the only ones that had any appetite to continue it. So with that in mind, we couldn't do that alone. So we were in a bad leverage position. I'm not saying that the JCPOA was a great deal, because it wasn't. But it was the best deal we could get, and it did, in fact, stop their race towards nuclear weapons. And so, with that in mind, that context is important to understand. And then, scrapping it like we did, and we're the Lone Rangers now. We've isolated our allies. The Chinese and the Russians sure as heck aren't going to follow along with it. So what are we trying to accomplish here? So I think what's going to happen here is that we're going to inch closer towards conflict in the region, which we don't need. We've got the neocons back in the advisory positions. These are the same people that brought us the Iraq War with what I would argue is disastrous consequences. And guess what? I think oil prices are going to start going up. So the gas prices at the pump are going to start going up. And I think that should be factored into this equation too. Listen, it's not a perfect deal. It was the best deal we could get, because we were kind of, our leverage wasn't the greatest at that point in time. Iran is a malign actor, no question about it. But we should have kept that deal intact, and then we should have gone after them on the missile technology and everything else. Let's start applying pressure on those aspects of their bad behavior. But unleashing them to now continue a march towards nuclear weapons at the same time, and now we're talking with the North Koreans, in my mind, was not a good decision.
We're with Dan Ward. He is one of two Democratic congressional candidates running for the Democratic nomination in the 7th District that's in Central Virginia. The winner of that will take on Republican Dave Bratt. This is one of the districts nationally that the Democrats have targeted. They think they can pick this up. Dan, a former Marine combat pilot now, and worked in the State Department. Now he's an airline pilot with United. So, Dan, look, I think you're half right. The one half that I agree with you on is that it's tough to go to these sanctions alone. In fact, I'm a White House correspondent. I tried to ask the question yesterday to Sarah. She didn't call on me. But the fact of the matter is, as long as the other countries want to deal with Iran and continue to have no sanctions, including those 7 European countries in it, China, Russia, etc., our level of sanctions doesn't really have that impact that it would have if other countries joined it. Obviously, the way that the president has been able to strangle the cash off from North Korea. So I agree with that end of it. But as far as the other end, to say that this thing was stopping them from getting a nuclear weapon, if you've ever listened to me at all, I'm not a neocon. I was opposed to all of these wars, including the first one, which I thought was asinine, that we were defending Kuwait that was not even an ally of ours. And Saddam Hussein thought it was, in his mind, it was their 11th province. He went to April Gillespie, our diplomat. She said, we don't get involved in it. That's been our policy for 5 decades. The whole thing is asinine. But look, Israeli government had evidence that they were building missiles and they were getting nuclear capability. What choice did we have? Just stick our head in the sand, Dan?
Well, the missiles weren't part of the deal, and that's what, as I mentioned, that's where we needed to start another kind of coalition building, diplomatic coalition building, to start putting pressure on their bad behavior in the missile world. But the JCPOA was about It's about the enrichment and the limiting of that, and the inspectors by the international inspecting. And so, by all accounts, they had lived up to that end of. I mean, they went right to the border of what they could, but they did stay inside the limits of the JCPOA. I'm not saying it was a great deal, because it wasn't, but it was the best deal we could get. It did slow down their nuclear development, and granted, it did have a sunset on it. But I think we should have kept that, and then let's put a team together and let's start going after their bad behavior. Now, I think it would have been a hard thing to do, simply because the Russians and the Iranians they're allies now. I mean, they're the ones that tipped the balance in Syria. Let's just be clear about that. Assad was going to be gone. He was going to fall had it not been for the Russians and the Iranians intervening both financially and militarily in that conflict. So, getting Russia on board a sanctioned regime against Iran, I think, would be next to impossible. But the Europeans and the United States, and if we could have worked some diplomatic, language with the Chinese, perhaps could have put some pressure on them on the missile technology. But as it is now, man, we're back to square one, and the interaction last night between Iran and Israel should scare everybody to death, because if Iran and Israel go to war, that means we will be going to war with Israel, I think. Because we are Israel's biggest ally, and we certainly supply them with a preponderance of their weaponry. So we're going to be in the middle of that. The last thing we need to do is have, kind of a Sarajevo in Syria or the skies over Syria. We need to start de-escalating things and not escalating them. The world is a very dangerous place right now, and it's time for cooler heads to prevail. We don't need to be starting. Some of the rhetoric I'm hearing from John Bolton sounds almost identical to the rhetoric I heard to the lead-up of the Iraq War, and we just don't need that.
These are the
one other thing that I'm running on is we are at a near record low percentage of veterans in Congress right now, and veterans have a history of working together, whether they're Democrats or Republicans. They work together better, and they're also more judicious in the use of military force. And so that's another aspect of my candidacy.
Dan, we totally agree on the neocon proliferation. The good news here is, and I know you don't support him, but I know the president, and instinctively he's not in favor of us getting involved in any of these conflicts. So I'm very confident there we're not going to get involved in it, because I know him for a very long time, and I know what he believes. Why should Democrats elect Dan Ward on June 12th instead of your opponent, Abigail Spanberger? Why vote for you, and why not her?
Well, I think there are a couple of things there. One is, I have I've got 6 years of experience of working up on Capitol Hill, 3 years at the State Department, 3 years in my Legislative Affairs Committee for my Airline Pilots Association. I understand pretty well how the Hill works, and understand really well how the executive branch works. I ran some pretty large programs at the State Department. Secondly, and I think it goes back, this is electability. I've always thought, and it's why I got into this race, that if a Democrat is going to win in the 7th, it's going to require a veteran and somebody that is lived and was raised in the rural parts of this district that can relate to because let's be honest, the majority of the voters in the rural parts of this district vote Republican. These are the same people I grew up with, and I can relate to them. I've got a farm. I can go down to the co-op, and I can talk to them about issues that they know about, and I think that that's the biggest difference. My opponent is from the suburbs of Richmond, and I think she's going to struggle to relate to those folks. And I think that that's where, we're going to need about 5% of people that typically vote Republican to vote for the Democrat to win in this race. And so that goes back to electability at that point.
All right, electability, that's it. Dan, people want more info. Where do they go?
It's www.danwardforcongress.com, and that's FOR, not the number.
danwardforcongress.com. Dan, thanks for being with us. We look forward to covering your primary race against Abigail Spanberger. That'll be decided in a Democratic primary, 7th District, June 12th.